Okay. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this panel about the BRICS that we are organizing. CEBRI is organizing with Quincy Institute from the United States. It's a pleasure to have Sarang, Shidore, Professor David Monyae, and Professor Marta Fernández here with us. This is the first panel that we are organizing with Quincy Institute in their new Global South program, and we couldn't have picked a better time to do it, because tomorrow, or today actually, is starting the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. And BRICS has become, for Brazil at least, a very important forum of international relations, one of the most important forums. And this morning here in Brazil, all the media outlets are talking about Brazil's position and what's going to happen to BRICS, or the global implication of BRICS nowadays, of many aspects. So we joined this, we put together this panel exactly to discuss what's going to be BRICS for the next couple of years, right? And we have here with us, first Professor Marta Fernández from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and also program director of the BRICS Policy Center in Rio, which is Brazil's most important think tank about BRICS. We have also Professor David Monyae, professor at the University of Johannesburg and co-director of the Center for African Chinese Studies. And as an international relations and foreign policy expert, Dr. Monyae previously served as a section manager, international relations policy analysis at the South African Parliament, providing strategic management and parliamentary foreign policy formulation and monitoring and analysis services. He has extensive experience as a member of South African academic delegations at meetings of India, Brazil, and South Africa, IPSA, Dialogue Forum, and BRICS summits as well. And we have Sarang Shidore, director of the Global South program at Quincy Institute and a senior non-resident fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He's also adjunct faculty at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Sarang has collaborated and published with multiple organizations, among which the Asian Peace Program and Brookings Institute. So again, thank you very much for being here with us. We had more than 300 registered. We have a lot of people here with us today. This session, we're gonna do a format of Q&A. So me as a moderator, we're gonna start questioning Professor Marta, then Professor David and Sarang, and we go from there. So Sarang, I give the word back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Feliciano. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and all our distinguished panelists. This is the first event that we are doing jointly between the Quincy Institute and CEBRI. So here's to many future such events and a partnership for the future. I'm sitting here in Washington. As Feliciano said, I'm the director of the Global South program, a new initiative from the Quincy Institute. And we at the Quincy Institute in Washington are focused on transforming American grand strategy in the vein of restraint, that is away from endless war and towards a focus much more on diplomacy, economic engagement, and combating existential threats such as climate change. This is our mission. So we do research and we do advocacy. And today's topic, BRICS, is very much aligned with what not just the news media is saying, but also what we here are increasingly focusing on. Over to you, Feliciano.
Thank you, Sarang. So Professor Marta, first question here for our panel. How has Brazil's perspective on the BRICS group evolved under the new Lula administration that started at the beginning of this year? And what notable differences or similarities exist compared to his previous tenure? Professor Marta, please.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. Related to the question, first, I can say that Lula is trying to connect his actual administration with the previous one from the motto, Brazil is back. Which Brazil is this and how it differs from, for example, Bolsonaro Brazil? We have, after 4 years of diplomatic isolation on the part of the former President Bolsonaro and unconditional alignment with Trump, United States, Lula Brazil is seeking to regain its lost international prominence, reaffirming its position as a major global player. One of the central forums for this has been exactly the BRICS. Although Bolsonaro's Brazil hosted the BRICS summit in 2019, guaranteeing the bloc's survival, the summit was small and empty since President Bolsonaro restricted participation to the 5 BRICS countries, in contrast to the tradition of inviting countries from the surrounding region. As evidence of the Brazilian government contempt for multilateral action via international organization, Bolsonaro, the government, left a debt of 5 billion reais with international organizations such as the UN and the New Development Bank, or the Bank of BRICS. On the other hand, Bolsonaro's view of the BRICS has always been quite contradictory. On the one hand, Bolsonaro was ideologically aligned with Indian President Modi and even Russian President Putin, with whom Bolsonaro identifying in terms of conservatism, the fight against so-called ideology of gender, and the reinforcement of a toxic masculinity. On the other hand, the Bolsonaro government was marked by hostility towards China, especially during Ernesto Araújo's time as the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Political hostility towards China contradicted Brazil's commercial interests, given that China is the country's leading trading partners of Brazil, and Bolsonaro has this commitment to advancing the interests of the agribusiness sector, whose exports to China in 2022 accounted for 32% of the total value of our exports. One of the main differences between the two governments is that while we think of Bolsonaro's government as defending a low-profile BRICS, the Lula government project for BRICS is structural, since Lula thinks of the bloc as a central player in advancing a less unequal and exclusionary world. The issue of tackling inequality runs through President Lula's entire agenda, and in this sense, BRICS is seen as a bloc capable of contributing to a more equitable distribution of economic, political, and ideological power in the world. The Brazil of Lula and the PT have a clear agenda favoring a multipolar order and in an inclusive system of global governance. In this sense, Brazil has been demanding the reform of international financial institutions in democratizing the global governance system. Given the difficulties facing reforming international institutions from within, Brazil has been supporting alternative mechanisms from outside, as in the case of BRICS Bank, to ensure greater control by emerging countries over the development financing and avoid the conditionalities and blackmail imposed by developed countries. At this summit, a central theme for Brazil has been the dollarization of the economy to reduce global dependence of the dollar in commercial transactions. Although operationally complex, the discussion has the potential to advance in this summit due to the new scenario that emerged with the Ukrainian war. Russia's particular interest in the issue is due to the militarization of the dollar. We see the United States aggressively using the dollar in the international financial system to make geopolitical gains against Russia. by freezing its reserves in dollars and expelling Russia from the SWIFT payment system. In this sense, the dollarization is being seen as one of, among other proposals that aim to build a less asymmetrical world, both economically and politically, in a more multi-centric one, so that a single power can no longer impose its will unilaterally on the others.
Thank you, Professor Marta. Now, Professor David. So what is the significance of BRICS for the Global South, specifically for South Africa and the hosting of the summit in Johannesburg? Thank you for being here with us again, Professor David.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting up what is indeed great discussions. I think BRICS Summit is starting at the backdrop of high tension at a global level. In answering the question directly, I think we need to give a historical background that the post-1945 world order was constructed without the active participation of the bulk of the international community, particularly Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The rules that were set in 1945 and continuously applied fairly and unfairly somehow has always been a problem. And therefore, the developing countries registered their dismay with this order, not in this summit as the world tend to see it. I think they registered the very first marked registration of dismay with the order was 1955 with the Bandung conference, where Asian and Latin American heads of states and people are gathered to say there's inequality at a global level, there's lack of technology transfer, culture, racism, imperialism, a number of issues that they registered in Bandung 1945. And if we look the history of the world that we lived since 1955, those issues remain unanswered. The developed world, led by the United States and Western world, entrenched their power and overrepresented in a number of key institutions of global governance. Beyond that, the manner in which they used what we see as global public goods has always been problematic. I think my colleague has touched upon. So these are issues that Africa, Latin America, and the bulk of Asia are demanding for change. So having said that, I think we need also to say something, that BRICS is not anti-West. BRICS does not want to smash the system. I think what the BRICS wants to do is to renegotiate the very same system and ensuring that the developing world is centered. While trying to do that, we also have seen in the post-Cold War that, and the rise of BRICS, that it also becoming somehow an elite group of countries within the developing countries. So while they're complaining about the issues at the global level, if you look within the global south, there are also disparities and there are issues that need to be looked at. And therefore, I would like to just clear the view that BRICS is not anti-United States, is not anti the West, nor is it anti the dollar. I think what BRICS members want to ensure that they increase the number of currencies in the global current basket so that they can trade among themselves without having any other currency, not only the dollar, whether it's euro or yuan for that matter, should not be at the center of, in terms of mediating that trade, because there's a lot of unfairness in the manner in which bigger hegemonic powers are managing their domestic issues. Policies that are taken in the United States, whether it's treasury, has a huge implication in the world whether it's Argentina or South Africa, that if the dollar appreciate overnight, the debt that the developing countries carry, it's massive. And a number of issues. The war that my colleague has also mentioned in Ukraine, we also have seen the increased weaponization of these, the dollar itself, sanctions applied, the abuse of the SWIFT system. So we see a number of reckless policies coming from Washington that the bulk of the developing countries, and Africa in particular, would want to ensure that the UN is reformed, it becomes truly democratic. The IMF, World Bank does not belong to United States and Europe alone. And also the power of countries in the world, economic and otherwise, is constantly changing. The G7, for instance, you take Italy or any other smaller members of G7 are much more smaller compared to Brazil, compared to India, compared to Russia, compared to China. And therefore, the ranking of states need to be looked at. It has been long since 1945. So this is the question that most Africans, with the certain contradictions within Africa, that South Africa is the only member, and therefore the expansion is to bring, you have Nigeria, which is the biggest economy with the largest population, you have Egypt, you have Ethiopia with more than 100 million people, and you have Kenya, rising powers, and therefore South Africa cannot continue being the only African voice. There is a need to expand and ensure that it becomes more an equitable, better world that we live in. This is in line with the policy of South African government of expanding its own trade, maintain strong relationship with Western countries, but expand trade to Latin America, to Asia, and ensure that should there be any crisis, we are not overtly dependent on one power. So in a nutshell, BRICS is critical to South Africa. It's, for the lack of a better term, I would use the word bandwagoning. South Africa is a tiny, small power in the bigger picture of things, and therefore it sees itself that its voice can be reinforced, can be strengthened if it speaks and write on this BRICS with Brazil, India, Russia, and China within multilateral, global multilateral institution and UN agencies. Its voice, its demands will be received much better than if it speaks on its own. So in a nutshell, BRICS is critical for the Africa and Africa agenda, Agenda 2063. I must end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I'd just like to remind we have 189 people online, and we have already received a number of questions. Many of those questions is about BRICS expansions. But Sarang, now with you, what is the significance of the same, more or less the same spirit of David's question? What is the significance of BRICS for the Global South? Does it signify a return to the promise of Bandung conference? Sarang, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Feliciano. So I think my panelists have done a fantastic job in laying out the background and also the relevance of BRICS at the moment. But just going back to the second part of your question on Bandung, and David Monyae mentioned Bandung as a foundational moment. It certainly was. It was the first time that Global South leaders got to know each other in a sort of a collective format in a Asian country at that time in Indonesia. But Bandung was a very different moment from where we are now. Bandung, in many ways, was a moment of in the shadow of decolonization. Decolonization was not even complete. It had started. It still had another 15 years to go before completion. In the case of South Africa, that moment arrived even later. So we had a different time, a different set of economic strengths of these powers who collected. They were very much in the mode of wanting that sort of technology transfer and aid from the West. And also the presence of China had a different significance. China at the time was very much a marginal country, far poorer, and very much a part of the global south. Where we are now is rather different. What we have today is that China is one of the major powers of the world, the second largest power. Indeed, it's a pole. It's one of the poles of the global order. And BRICS also includes Russia. So what we have in BRICS, as different from Bandung, although many similarities exist, but the difference is that we have in BRICS more of an East-South coalition sitting in the room. The global south represented by the three powers, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And if I could use the term global east, represented by Russia and China. And they are together in the room, especially the global south countries are in the room, not because, as Professor Monyae said, they're anti-Western, far from it. India is a very close partner of the US. Brazil and South Africa have excellent relationships with Washington. They want America to be at the table, to play a role. But they look at the world and they have drawn some conclusions. One conclusion they've drawn is about the future. They see, since the war on terror, since the end of the Cold War, they see the diffusion of power away from Washington towards other capitals. It's slow. It's still in the middle stages, perhaps, and it's certainly not complete. But they do wonder a future where the world becomes much more multipolar. And it's a good hedging strategy to have coalitions with the East, to have an alternative structures of articulating what they want, should the world continue to transform the way it is transforming. So it's a sort of a hedging strategy. But it's also about the present, because the present order that is led by the US and has done a lot of good in many instances, like the Marshall Plan, for example. But nevertheless, today has some serious shortfalls. It doesn't meet the needs of much of the global south. As my co-panelists pointed out, there are issues to do with equitable development. There are issues to do with climate change and how that is seen, whether we stick to the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, or we just tell that or the global south states that you're equally you have to do the same as the wealthier countries, although they're not responsible for a lot of the emissions. It's also about bringing peace in Ukraine. If you look at the G7 statements and you contrast them to the BRICS, you see a very stark difference on the way the G7 articulates the war and what the BRICS has called for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. So a number of issues like that, the BRICS states are sending a message. The global south in this forum is sending a message that we want the global order to change so that it better aligns with our interests. And that is a message that is coming louder and more clearer as we move forward. And this summit represents, with the expansion on the agenda, represents a maturing of that demand.
Thank you, Sarang. Thank you very much. Now, Marta, back to you. So since we're talking about expansion, regarding the potential of expansion of BRICS with the inclusion of additional member countries, how does Brazil position itself on this matter? How controversial is this position within Brazil? Marta.
Firstly, the fact that the summit is being held in South Africa, I think it offers a symbolic ground for this expansion, given that South Africa itself was the first beneficiary of the growth in 2011. The agenda for expanding the BRICS is today being led above all by China and Russia, revealing to some extent the influence of these two powers in the grouping. After the last BRICS summit in 2022, hosted by Beijing and held online, expanding the group was strengthened and primarily dictated by current geopolitical configurations. I have been arguing that the Ukrainian war was functioning as an invisible or unspoken agenda because the members of the grouping have to avoid it. And have to avoid it because Russia, the invading power, is one of the 5 BRICS powers. At the same time as the issue is avoided, since the BRICS is committed to respecting the sovereignty of states, which Russia has violated, the war in the Ukraine has been on the agenda of the leaders taking part in the summits here in South Africa. In what way? As a result of the war in Ukraine, in the growing tensions between the United States and China, resulting in what has become known as the Cold War 2.0, it has become attractive for both countries, for China and for Russia, to expand the BRICS members countries. Both countries have seen the expansion as a way of enlisting geopolitical allies from the global south in opposition to the West. The issue today is not the lack of applicants to join the group, since 23 countries have already formally submitted applications, either for economic or ideological reasons, revealing in some way the political capital of the BRICS. But it is still unclear how to order the entry of new members without compromising the so much acclaimed unity in diversity of the BRICS, or what admission criteria should be prioritized. There is a fear that the enlarged BRICS could be plagued by problems of political coordination, as well as becoming inoperable, since the entry of new members would make it extremely difficult to reach a consensus on issues that today, with only 5 members, are already the subject of many negotiations, such as the very issue of BRICS expansion. Adding new letter to the acronym, which already gained a letter now with the entry of South Africa, could ultimately turn all the members into a big plus, just as happened with the G77. But you also know from our experience, based on the justification offered by the permanent members of the Security Council for postponing its reform, how much these justifications, such as the risk of the body being frozen due to the expansion of the veto, albeit they are true, they also mask the political interests involved. Regarding these political interests involved, there are doubts as to whether such expansion will favor Brazil, for example, which today enjoys aid and prominence in the BRICS, but which could have its influence diluted with the entry of new members, as several political analysts and diplomats have warned. However, denying the entry of new countries has considerable political costs, above all because it could signal to the world that BRICS is more of the same. In other words, more of an exclusivist club than a family based on solidarity, as has been claimed by its members. In this sense, not accepting new members goes against one of the group's central agendas, democratizing international decision-making process. It's worth highlighting the centrality of this agenda for Brazil itself, given its historical claim to permanent membership on the Security Council. Brazil already seems to have realized that it can play this card in the BRICS expansion process, not only by demanding a more emphatic position from China, which in April already declared its support for a more democratic and representative Security Council. As a diplomatic interviewer, one of the criteria defended by Brazil would be the commitment of any candidate for membership to support a broad reform of the global governance system, especially its Security Council.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marta, about the issue of expansion. I always remind my students that a lot of countries are asking to join BRICS. I don't remember very much if there are a lot of countries asking to join the G7. So that sends a little bit of the signal of different coalitions that we're talking about here. So now back to David. Professor David, how does South Africa and Africa more broadly views BRIC value? This is something that you already touched upon. And what is South Africa's view on expanding BRICS membership, especially when it comes to Africa? This is something that you already mentioned. I'd like to elaborate more on that. Professor David, please. You're muted, Professor David.
Thank you. I think my starting point is to go back to the conceptual issues. I think our understanding of BRICS, as per Jim O'Neill, the main person that came up with this name, is that is much more of a neoliberal understanding of what BRICS is. It is born out of the Wall Street, understanding numbers, markets, and it is devoid of the people. So I think what is being constructed and what we see coming before us, for us to understand and a shift in our thinking, it is that there is a construction of a people-centered BRICS, a developmental BRICS that is a representative of all regions. So it's not just how much money you have, how big is your economy. It is the people you represent and the aspiration of the global South people, the need to develop infrastructure, question of health, COVID-19, vaccine nationalism that we saw coming in. And all these things put together are some of the issues that are driving a number of countries, particularly my own country, in joining BRICS. And it is a democratic, a liberal democracy with a very, very strong, vibrant constitutional, liberal constitution. And therefore, the notion, a very simplistic notion that coming from the West of democracy and authoritarian, it's a very minimum, a simplistic way of looking at things. BRICS is much more bigger than just mere democracies and authoritarianism. It's looking at more issues of developmental states and how do we drive them as engine of growth in terms of bringing more energy in a much more climate sensitive way. How do we bring in women? How do we deal with conflicts? And how then do we become truly democratic without really choosing people based on ideological democracy and all the kind of issues that are being peddled in our today's world. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now, Sarang, I have a question for you. From your, and I think it's an important question since we're talking about the relationship between BRICS and the West. So from your perspective in Washington, D.C., how has the United States viewed BRICS and how should it respond it? Right? Sarang, please.
Yes. I think it's interesting. As Professor David said, it was coined by a sort of a Wall Street-oriented figure. It was about emerging markets at the time. And these were seen as sort of these emerging markets for investment and so forth, and stock portfolios and FDI. Now, I think that's still relevant in the sense that economic power does translate into influence in many ways in the global system. That's just the reality of it. In the United States, though, outside of those who come from that world that originated the concept, the US government has not said a whole lot about the BRICS. There generally has been a sort of a quiet watching, if you will. The commentators now have had their own views. Some commentators have dismissed the BRICS as being sort of more of a talk shop, not having a lot of impact, not doing very much, if you will. But many have simply ignored it. Now, I see that changing. I see that changing after the Ukraine war. This BRICS summit is getting a lot of coverage in ways that I don't recall for earlier summits. So I think there is some shift happening. The problem is fundamentally that the United States looks at the world, at least in the foreign and security spaces, in terms of its regional commands. So you have the CENTCOM, you have the Indo-PACOM, and you have the AFRICOM. And these define in many ways how the US structures its policies from the security side, but they also sometimes bleed over into other areas. So for example, the Indo-PACOM starts in India and goes all the way across Asia to Japan. CENTCOM starts from Pakistan and goes all the way west to Egypt and so forth. BRICS is interesting because it's transcontinental. It spans 3 continents in ways that cross-cut American ideas of the world order, which are substantially security-driven. So there is a bit of that misalignment in evolving policy. So both taken together means that the US hasn't had much of a response. I think that's a mistake. I think the fact that BRICS, as you mentioned, there are 20 plus countries lining up. When a club has a waiting list, it's doing something right? So the club, clearly a lot of countries want to join the club. It may not have had a huge impact as yet of reforming the world order, but these things never happen overnight. These things happen over a long period of time. And the fact that we are seeing an accretion of the BRICS, the fact that we are seeing them taking on even impossible agendas like de-dollarization, even as talking points, and the fact that they are asserting certain norms. If you look at the joint statements from the last summits and so forth, they're quite different from the G7 joint statements, not just on Ukraine, on many issues. At the same time, the BRICS wants to work with the West. For example, on terrorism, there's a very strong statement on it that aligns perfectly with what Washington might prefer. So there are areas of commonality, there are areas of difference. I think the way forward is for the United States to start actually responding to some of these demands in terms of actual policy. We are seeing some good signs in terms of President Biden's team saying very clearly many times in Southeast Asia, elsewhere, that we don't want countries to choose. We want to offer a choice. Now, that's a good thing to say. It would be good to walk the talk fully on that. It would be good to say to various states that we can offer you these solutions. We have not been very, let's say, adventurous on climate. We have not been so adventurous on looking at peace in Europe that's affecting food security, for example. And we have not been, we have in many ways not been helpful on the WTO system. We have held up the appellate body and so forth. So things of that sort, serious steps in that direction will go a long way in strengthening the goodwill the US already has in these capitals.
Thank you, Sarang. Now we're going to go for the last round of questions to our panelists. We're accumulating more than 30 questions in the Q&A. We're going to, while Professor Marta, David, and Sarang respond to the last round of questions, I will tabulate the questions here and trying to bring back to them. So, Professor Marta, some experts assert that China's increasing influence within BRICS might be disproportionately affecting other member nations. You touched upon that a little bit. What is your assessment of this situation? What is China's role within BRICS nowadays, beyond the issue of expanding?
Exactly. In some way, this issue is directly related to the question of expansion, about the entry of new members of the BRICS, because while the entry of new members could diminish Brazil's relative influence, on the other hand, it could accentuate China already exacerbated influence in the group by incorporating members that are commercially and financially dependent on China, creating the opportunity to project its influence in key areas of the world. However, 2 political situations should raise alarm bells in China. First, Brazil's recent past with Bolsonaro government, and Argentina projected future with governments hostile to China. Recently, the favorite candidate in the Argentina elections, Javier Milei, declared his intention to freeze relations with China based on the argument, would you trade with a murderer? As well as advocating the dollarization of the economy of Argentina. But the inequality of power within the BRICS is exemplified, for example, by the very case of the Brazil-China relationship, given that China buys 70% of the Brazil soya, and 68% of the iron ore. The risk of this inequality of power within the BRICS is that China will increasingly be able to impose its agenda on the other members, as in the case of Brazil. Although China, like Brazil, rejects the idea that you are living through a new Cold War, you are increasingly seeing Chinese anti-Americanism and anti-Western rhetoric, which is highly seductive for countries that have been victims of colonial histories, such as Brazil, India, and South Africa. However, this anti-Western rhetoric could jeopardize Brazil's desired role, for example, for mediating the peace process between Russia and Ukraine. Against the Cold War logic that divides the world into two antagonist poles organizing in dichotomous terms, good versus evil, Brazil is interested in moving the order toward multipolarity and a geological atmosphere that opens space for politics. I think Brazil can contribute to de-escalating the conflict by moderating the anxieties of both sides, and it still has the advantage of not being perceived as a direct threat to the West. Brazilian foreign policy has been resisting affiliating unconditionally to one of the poles to move with autonomy and room to maneuver through the poles, based on analysis of each team according to principles such as the defense of democracy or the Amazonia with Biden, and the interests of the countries such as Brazil's commercial interests with Russia, its main supplier of fertilizers. In this sense, while Brazil, as well as South Africa, as Ramaphosa declared yesterday, is more connected to a logic of active non-alignment, the great power disparity between BRICS members can force the system toward a logic of bipolarity in both material and ideological terms, diminishing in some way the freedom of action of Brazil.
Thank you, Marta. Now, Professor David, how has South Africa handled the issue of Russia participation in the summit, considering the major media speculation early on Putin's possible visit? So even here in Brazil, with the media, there was a lot of discussion about that, on the condemnation of Vladimir Putin International Criminal Court, and the fact that South Africa is a full member of it, and there will be complications if the president of Russia visited South Africa. So how can you elaborate on that for us, Professor David?
Well, thank you. I think, look, the South African government made a lot of blunders. I think it got punished for things that has nothing to do with South Africa. The South African position is quite clear on the war, that indeed the move by Russia into Ukraine, its violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But having said that, South Africa's major issue has to do with the application of international law and how we look at interventions, not just the Ukraine intervention. We're very much mindful of Libya and the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, the destruction of the state in Libya that has caused massive havoc in the Sahel region, with all endless coups that are taking place, was the making of the United States and European countries. Massive violation of human rights, bombardment from the air, locking up African airspace. I think South Africa and Africa is mindful of what happened in Iraq, shock and awe, the destruction of Iraq, very mindful of what happened in Syria, what happened in Afghanistan. And therefore, I think majority of South Africans and Africans in general are of the view that we should not isolate issues that we look at Ukraine at the expense of other crises such as Yemen, and how the international community is responding. And then there's a need of fairness in terms of how to handle. So if Russia is as bad as the US in terms of the manner in which it intervened in a number of these issues. So that is the first issue, just to clear that it's human rights driven foreign policy. However, when it comes to the application of that foreign policy and the head of states, we took kind of tardiness in terms of how, as members of BRICS and strategic partner to all these BRICS countries, South Africa had a military navy exercise, and the timing was terrible. I mean, this is my own personal view. If I was the president or advisor, I wouldn't have allowed the Navy drills to take place at the same day of anniversary of the war. It was insensitive in my own view. But anyway, the government carried on, and there was a backlash from the West. But the lessons are that President Putin wouldn't have come to South Africa with or without so-called Lady R. Because if we look at the history of President Putin in the post-Ukraine invasion, he did not attend the Indonesia G20 meeting for obvious reasons. It's not safe to move for him, and that crisis at home, and he's the commander-in-chief, a country at war. And we as South Africa got bogged down in these issues without clarifying them from the word go, and be assertive and set our agenda. But having said all what I've said, I need to return back to the manner in which US has treated South Africa, which is perceived as anti-South Africa's membership of BRICS. Bully, and the manner in which message was sent, the misbehavior of the US ambassador in South Africa, with a heavy cost in terms of our currency, how it reacted to his statements, and a lesson to the West in general, that don't look at BRICS country or small countries in Africa as countries that do not think on their own. These are states that are rational state actors. They have interest and they carry their interest. It doesn't matter how small they are. And therefore, to treat them, be with us or else, we won't give you bread tomorrow, be with us or else, in an arrogant language, as if this is 1945. The US position in the world, as powerful as it is, as hegemonic, its power on a decade by decade is declining. And I do not think in the next 20, 30 years, it will command the same power. Therefore, there is a need of rethink within the US, where to maximize areas of convergence in terms of interest between South Africa, Africa, with the United States on a number of issues. We are democracy, we are a number of things, and invest and intervene on the African continent in a way that is mutually beneficial to the United States and Africa. As it stands, it's not the case. It's just a question of us get rid of the dragon, get rid of China, get rid of Russia. And that won't win the case, won't win the argument. It really blackmails the United States as nothing else other than an imperialist power that is pulling its way through on the African continent. So there's a lot of thinking within the US elite, US governing elite, to really think than just the view that is so offensive to most Africans, that China is it's a neo-colonial, it's a colonial power. I really do not think that Africa has issues with China, but those issues are handled differently. And therefore, I think the United States needs to find constructive way of playing its own game in its Africa policy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now, Sarang, for the last question for you. How does the India-China rivalry impact BRICS? Could it sabotage its rise or at least freeze it? Sarang, please.
Yeah, just before I answer that, one comment on US-Africa policy, at least on the Sahel, we are seeing perhaps the US policy that's more reasonable than the French approach. There has been some attempt to reach out. There's been some attempt to engage. Obviously, it is not yet in a way that perhaps can bring a solution. But there is a more complex thinking in the administration on looking at the global South. There are different voices, there are contestations. There's a long way to go. But there is a difference, I think, between now and where we were in the 90s or the noughties, when there was really a unipolar moment internalized in Washington. Now, very slowly, there is a sense emerging that we have to play this differently. Now, how it translates to policy, we will see. On the India-China question, that is absolutely one of the dividing lines in BRICS, perhaps the most significant one, because as we know, India and China are engaged in a very serious geopolitical rivalry. We have had deaths of troops in 2020 in a clash in the mountains. Since then, we have seen a huge buildup of troops on both sides that remain largely in position. There's been some easing. Some confidence-building measures are being discussed at the moment. In fact, BRICS provides a forum for leaders like those of India and China to sit in the same room without drawing flack, because they are in a multilateral setting, in a neutral setting, and they can talk on the sidelines. So if they choose to. So in a sense, there is that rivalry, but there's also these spaces like BRICS create avenues for that conversation. But more relevant to BRICS, they also create incentives to manage those differences within the BRICS agenda. So we are not seeing India and China making a huge issue of their bilateral differences within the BRICS format. They are working in many fora. There are multiple fora now within BRICS on various issues, from climate to finance to health and so forth. They're working in those fora. And I am relatively optimistic that these differences can be managed. I think at the end of the day, BRICS states don't need to be all close friends, but they need to have a common interest on certain issues. And if that common interest is there, then there will be cooperation in the longer run. So India and China, for example, agree on issues like climate change. They agree broadly on issues like Ukraine, although there are differences there, but nevertheless, they don't want the war to continue. They also agree on reform of international financial institutions. So there's enough there that's in common for them to continue working together in the future.
Thank you, Sarang. We have received more than 30 questions here for various issues, which also shows how people are interested on the issue of BRICS, and we have 180 participants still with us. I mean, if I could divide these questions, I would divide in two groups. The first, I think the bulk of the questions is about the issue of expansion. Specific, mention a couple of candidates like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iran, Argentina, so on and so forth. But the other group of questions is about the concrete results of BRICS. Right? I think there are many questions about, so what are the concrete results in terms of diplomatic results, economic and financial results, and even rebuilding of international order. And if I may use my power of moderator here, I'd like to speculate a very short, very fast on the issue of concrete results. The most common concrete results you get from BRICS, usually from the literature, is the construction of the new development bank, right? Which now has the new members, the Bangladesh, Egypt, and the Emirates, right? Which might hint the becoming a member of NDB. It's the first step to become a full member of BRICS, something that we'll wait for this summit to decide. But the second type of concrete results that I usually talk about is if you look, it's an example that happened to Brazil. If you look at Brazil-India relations, so Brazil and India have never been close partners, and they were close in a multilateral forum, but had never had a very strong and close bilateral relationship. If you look now, the bilateral relationship between India and Brazil has never been it's very, very good. Brazil has positioned itself in a very better position when it comes to India, India towards Brazil. And the reason for that is BRICS. It's because the Brazilian leaders and the Indian leaders have been meeting year after year at these summits, and that meeting trickles down to all parts of government and the entrepreneurs, universities, so on and so forth. Now Brazil is in a if India becomes tomorrow a very big importer of food stuff, Brazil is in a very good position to be one of the main suppliers. So if you look at within BRICS in itself, the relationship between Brazil and all big BRICS members, including South Africa, is much, much closer exactly because of BRICS. It happened probably the same with the G7, right? If you're all the time there meeting with the G7 countries, we're going to be much closer, despite the differences that we have amongst ourselves. And the second aspect, and I think it relates to a second aspect, which is the most common narrative of Brazil's justification to be a member of BRICS is more or less what Marta portrayed in her answers, is the narrative of construction of the building a multipolar order in which Brazil is one of the poles and which is a more equitable multipolar order. But I think it's also a matter of political access. What India, China, and Russia offered to Brazil when the creation of BRICS is a political access in a level that Brazil has never had with the United States or Europe, in the highest level possible. Right, with the president of Brazil meeting the president of China, the prime minister of India, and the president of Russia in a way, in a consistent that we never had with the West. The West has never offered that, never hinted an offer. I mean, of all the BRICS members, maybe Brazil is the only country that can be both a BRICS member and a G7 member, G8 member. That was never under the table. That was never over the table. It has never been an offer on that regard, right? So that's something that India and China and Russia have offered countries like South Africa and Brazil. Well, why would we say no to that? If we had said no to that, it would be one of the biggest mistakes of our foreign policy in history. So that's something to be always. I mean, I tell them to my American diplomats friends that I have here in Brazil. Sometimes I meet with them. Is that look, what we want at the end is acknowledgement, right? So that's what China offered. The United States did not offer on the same level, right? Acknowledgement leads to concrete results. So, Joe, it's already 12 o'clock. We have just a few minutes. So I'd like the final words and more or less speculate on the issue of concrete results. I will start with Marta, then I go with David, and then Sarang. Marta, please.
Okay, my internet is a little bit unstable, but I will try to have my final remarks. I think one thing that is important to say about this expansion is that some countries that are trying to enter in the BRICS, like Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., are countries that have a history of gender oppression and so there is a kind of diplomatic movement also to try to in some way to strengthen the power of, for example, IBAS. IBAS that is composed by South Africa, by India, but that there is more potential to advance some thematics. For example, because of course, BRICS is in some way very attached to to confront the inequalities, but some inequalities are omitted. For example, the question of gender inequality. And so there is this movement also that in some way is leading by the diplomacy and academics that are afraid of this expansion also because of this question related to the gender equality and other rights. And if I understood, because my internet is so unstable, I agree with the one that said that Brazil has not have lots of advantage to be near the West. if you think, and I think David put this, the system since the end of the Second World War, since 1945, is structured by the West, the UN, the international financial institution. So in some way, I think that BRICS emerged precisely to say, no, this system did not offer to us the political or economical gains that in some way we represent in the world, especially today. So these institutions are not representative of this, and there is this kind of difficult to reform these institutions. So what I think is that the very idea of the creation of the bank of the BRICS Bank, is stimulated by the idea that they in some way are tired to try to reform this institution from within. So they are in some way searching for alternative mechanisms that can in some way function in a more equality terms, for example, in promoting the development, helping to finance the development of the emerging countries without the conditionalities that are characteristic of the Western donors, for example, or the Western international institutions.
Thank you, Marta. Professor David, your last words, and thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you. Here are my concluding remarks. I think when we look at BRICS, we have to be mindful of what drives South Africa, what drives the African continent into joining a body such as BRICS. It opens up a number of opportunities. I think what is coming much more, it's less of BRICS, more of what is it that Africans can do to build more infrastructure, take advantage of changes taking place at the global level, and the competition that is there, and the tension that we see. I think what is key is that Africa has minerals, rich minerals, and not just ordinary minerals, strategic minerals, whether it's uranium in Niger, whether it's lithium in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Nigeria, and quite a number of Ghana. So the bigger question here where China is taking advantage, realizing the unhappiness of Africans with the Western world who come in and extract minerals to the West. China has started building a beneficiation kind of setup in Zimbabwe on lithium. I think it will be high time for the United States to understand some of these dynamics and demands. Resource nationalism is on the rise. And therefore, I think instead of fighting the Chinese and the Russians, I think it would be much more better to meet Africans halfway and building and ensure that they benefit in the whole value chain of their minerals without this naked exploitation by the very same powers that are advancing democracy and the like. And the question of pricing. So what Africans want in their development are cell phones, access to cell phone, to move tomatoes from rural areas to urban areas for markets. They're less interested whether that cell phone is a Huawei or it's a Swiss or American. They give no worry about all those things. They need a cheap cell phone. So instead of wasting time talking about China, take advantage of building affordable cell phones for Africans, infrastructure, the so-called debt trap, spend more time in understanding Africa's Agenda 2063, the wish of Africans to connectivity to trade among themselves and take advantage of those issues. I think that would be a much more better global South agenda for the United States, instead of using a military vehicle in dealing with more military bases in Africa, more aid that is not reaching people. It goes to corrupt leaders and opening runways in deserts that people really don't even worry. So in a nutshell, BRICS is important. How we understand BRICS and the West, the way they're responding, perhaps we need to find an area where we converge and understand what is it that we can do together with the West and what is it that we can do with the East. I think that's what drives South Africa and most of Africans. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Professor David. Sarang, you have the floor now. Final words, please.
I'm just going to spend a minute since we are over time. I'm just going to say one thing. The United States is a large country. It's not a monolith. And there are debates emerging more than in the sidelines on how to deal with this vast region called the Global South. These debates have to be seeded with more information, better perspectives, like we have on today's panel. And I think the idea is, I think the United States doesn't want to lose this game. The question is, will it have the right strategy to win this game in a way that it retains influence in a world where it may not be dominant for the long haul? So that's the sort of questions we look at the Quincy Institute. And we do think that such a policy correction is possible. And in a way that working with partners like South Africa, India, and Brazil, which are not rivals of the United States, they are partners. I think this can be moved forward.
Thank you, Sarang. I'd like to thank everybody. Professor David Monyae from University of Johannesburg, Professor Marta Fernández from the Catholic University of Rio, Sarang Shidore, Director of Global South Program at Quincy Institute. In the name of CEBRI, as an academic director of CEBRI, I'd like to thank everybody from the audience. We had up to 180 people. Now we have still 150 people with us. Good luck for the summit in Johannesburg, for the South African hosting the summit there. So bye-bye. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ciao.